Hi, so welcome back to the show. Today we're going to talk about something very important to all accountants. What, behind every great business, what you usually find is there are some great accountants involved. Now, in this episode, what we're going to talk about is what actually makes you a great accountant. So definitely want to stay tuned.
Welcome to another episode of the Finance and the Accounting Show. This is the place to go for small business owners. If you're looking for a great way to understand the finance and the accounting side of your business, you're in the right place. So stay tuned and enjoy the episode.
Now, the reason why this is a very important topic is because there are a ton of business owners that reach out to me, ask me for help, and they're asking me about different businesses, different opportunities, and I'm trying my best to provide help that I can. And I'm trying my best to provide insight or support. And one of the things, or one of the challenges that I run into at times is that they're telling me that they're finding accountants that don't seem to be all that great for what they're trying to do. And I completely understand and I get the friction that's created. And part of that is because the accountants are really lacking in a lot of areas. And if you're not working with an accountant that has what I typically call like four critical areas, if they're not good in these four critical areas, then you're typically going to have some challenges. So I decided, let me actually start helping more business owners understand, hey, here are the four signs or four characteristics of a great accountant. So when you're looking to work with someone, if that person does not have these four traits, chances are they might be good, but chances are they aren't going to be great. And so as I started telling more business owners this, one of the things that I realized is business owners really, really, really gravitated to it. And this made a lot of sense to them. And several of the business owners actually started switching who they were doing business with. Or I guess you could say, for lack of a better word, is several business owners started firing their accountants because they realized is my accountant is not great at these things. And that is, so it was one of those things where as an accountant, I was like, if other business owners that I'm talking to are actually making more decisions around finding an accountant who has these areas, it would probably be great to just share that with other accountants. So as you're trying to develop and grow, your small firm, as you're trying to attract more clients, as you're trying to take your accounting firm to the next level, this becomes a very important and a very helpful topic. But before I jump into the details, for those of you that may not be familiar with who I am, my background is accounting and finance. I am a CPA. So I'm not just like some random person talking about the accounting profession. I'm actually a participant in the accounting profession. I lead my own firm, the TL Turner Group, where we provide bookkeeping and CFO services. We are not a full service accounting firm. And I know that that is a very big thing that a lot of accountants aim to be a full service. We're not a full service because we're not great at all of the things that are required in a full service. And to be completely honest with you, we've done in the past, over the past year and a half, we've done about 470 plus interviews and conversation with business owners. And one of the things that we found out is that when a accounting firm says we're a full service, accounting firm, or we're a full service XYZ or whatever, the businesses that are successful, they actually don't trust you. It actually lowers the amount of trust that they have in you. Because one of the things that successful businesses understand is that, hey, for us to be successful, we had to be very clear about what we're good at, what we do, and what we can't do, which means we can't be full service. We can't be all things to all people. And whenever business owners hear someone say, oh, we're a full service accounting firm, the trust factor immediately starts to go down because they're like, there's no way you can be successful or good at what you do if you are truly a full service. Now, as you start to become, like I said, a bigger firm, let's say, you're a much bigger, like, you're moving closer to the category of, like I said, some of the, the big four accounting firms. Some people have the perception that, hey, because I'm a really big accounting firm, maybe I can be full service. But then again, or companies, clients still don't trust you. Because I remember working at a Fortune, I think it was like a Fortune 25 company. So one of the 25 largest companies in the world. And we were having a discussion about, hey, we need to bring in we wanted to bring an accounting firm to help with some adjustments or some things some projects we were trying to work through. And someone had brought up, like, oh, we can bring up, one of the big four or whatever. For the next 30 minutes, what we really started to talk about is, okay, all right, which big four is actually the right fit for this? Because a lot of people would just say, oh, the big four, they can do it all. It's like, although they are a big company, they're a global company, they have tons of resources, the perception of the client is still, we don't think it's possible for you to do all things and be good at it. So what we started narrowing it down is, well, this firm is good at this firm is good at this firm is good at this. And the truth of the matter is, they had the talent to, on paper, that firm could do probably all the areas that we discussed. But the reality of it is your clients don't perceive you to be that way. Your clients perceive you are good at a few things. That's what we expect you to be good at. That's what we're willing to pay you for. But when you start getting outside of those areas, to be completely honest, we just don't trust that you're good at those things. So I say all that to say that that's one of the critical strategies of being a great accountant, is knowing what you're good at. And at the TL Turner Group, that's one of the things that we have clarified, that we are really great at bookkeeping and we are great at CFO services. Now, the other thing is, we're not great for every industry. There are certain industries that we are great for, which I'll talk about that later. But that becomes the starting point of being a great accountant, is having that clarity of knowing, what are you good at, or what are you not good at, what are you average at, what are you good at, and then what are you great at. And if you're going to be a great accountant, that means you focus more on the things that you are great at, because you can't be a good account, or I guess let's put it this way, you can't be a great accountant if you're focused on spending too much time on things that you are good at. So that becomes the basis. And I always like to share, like I said, that concept and that background, because that's something that took me some time to grasp and some time for me to understand, is I can't be great at everything. And if I'm going to be a great accountant, that means I need to spend more time doing the things that I'm great at. And if I'm going to spend more time doing the things that I'm great at, I need to be very clear. What is it that I can do? What is it that I am great at doing? And one of the things that we've realized at the TL Turner Group is, we're great at bookkeeping. We're great at CFO services. One of the other things that we are also great at is, we are great at making content that helps make accounting and finance simpler for business owners, meaning we don't complicate it. Like, we don't make it a challenge. We don't make it a chore. Like, we really know how to simplify it, and we really know how to make it simple for business owners. And that is what we do very well, which is why we create tons of content in doing it. And we stay in those areas very, very well. Now, specifically when it comes down to, I can say, we're not looking at a very specific industry, but we're looking at what are 4 common characteristics that really make an accountant a great accountant. Now, as we talk to a ton of different businesses, we've talked to a ton of different accountants. I mean, I remember when I started my firm, one of the first things that I did, well, actually, before I left my full-time job to work in my own firm, one of the things that I did is I reached out to all of the CPAs and the fractional CFOs in my city that were willing to talk to me. And I set up a lunch or set up a meeting or set up a phone call. and hopped on a phone call and I had a conversation with them. And I talked to them and really understood some things about, some that were very successful, some that were early stage, they were kind of struggling, some of them that only approached their accounting practice as a side business because, hey, they didn't feel comfortable leaving the comforts of their full-time job, so they just did it as a side business, which is perfectly fine. But one of the things that I learned is that there were some very, very common characteristics that I was hearing. And these characteristics were also very, very applicable for those that are working in a profession. Let's say, if you're an accountant or you're a finance professional in corporate America, like even if you're in corporate, these characteristics, these traits are the things that make you great. Because I remember getting calls from people that I worked with in the past. And one of the things that they talked about is like, Terrell, I really miss working with you. Like, I'm happy you started your own firm, but I really miss working with you. And a lot of times the things that they would say next really pointed to these 4 characteristics. So let's jump into them. The 4 characteristics of a great accountant. First one is comprehension. Second one is practical. Third is communication. And the fourth is they are multilingual. Now, we're gonna go step by step. And part of it is because we really need to unpack it and break it down, because there are a lot of people who may see these words and think they know what they mean. But one of the great things about an accountant, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to the third one, is you don't take it for granted that the other person knows what you mean. What you really want to do is you want to focus on making sure that you can effectively get your message across. Hence the whole idea behind comprehension. So when you think about comprehension, what that really means is do they have the ability to help their audience or help the person that they're talking to, help that person actually comprehend the message that they are trying to get across? And regardless of whatever area you are talking about, whether you're trying to help the sales team understand, revenue recognition, or whether you're trying to help, the engineering team understand whether you need to capitalize or expense the testing costs or the pre-development costs. Whatever you are trying to do, the question that you should be asking yourself as an accountant is, am I focused on helping that person or that audience actually comprehend what I am trying to say? Or is my focus solely on compliance? Because see, the tension between compliance and comprehension is a very, very, very big. And it is very uncomfortable for a lot of people, because in reality, we are trained to actually focus on compliance. I mean, if you think about all of our training as accountants, in school, we were really taught compliance. When you took, whether it was your tax class, whether it was that you took your gap accounting, or whether you took like a governmental accounting class, like we were trained to focus on compliance. We were trained to focus on like, hey, what makes this situation align with the rules? And when you have that compliance focus, what it then does is it creates friction and challenge for you, because when you're focused on compliance, it's, are you in line with the rules? Are you in line with what's going on there? Which is important, because you don't want to be an accountant that is not in line with the proper rules and the proper guidelines. You do want to be in line with the proper rules and the proper guidelines. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to sacrifice the comprehension of your people in order to be in line with the rules and the regulations. You want to make sure that you are actually balancing the two. And that's what a great accountant can do. A great accountant can balance the two. I mean, because when you think about it, for a tax accountant, yes, you want to make sure that you are following the IRS code, because you were trained If you're a tax accountant, you are trained to make sure that, hey, your job is to keep your client compliant. But when it comes down to how you communicate with your client and the information you share with your client and how you go about engaging your client, you have to kind of take your focus off of just solely being compliant and focus on how do I help them comprehend what is going on in this area. Like, I need to focus on being able to help them comprehend what I'm doing. Same thing as when it comes down to following gap. Like, a story in the situation that that happened recently was I got a call from a non-for-profit, and they were going through this situation where they were trying to get an audit, and the audit had been dragging on for about 2 years. 2 years, and this audit still has not been completed. And one of the first things I asked, like, what is going on here? And so I got on a call with a client and talked with them to understand, like, okay, where is the disconnect? And one of the things that I noticed is that the auditor was asking for things in probably following their audit program, asking for things that they were probably should have been asking for. But the way that they were asking for it was in a way that the client had no idea how to actually fulfill that request. And of course, yes, I mean, the client didn't have all of their stuff organized and all their stuff together, but part of it also is that the auditor didn't know how to help them comprehend what they were asking for and what information, what insight that they were after. So you want to make sure that as you're working through this stuff, it's just figuring out, hey, am I focused on just checking the box on my compliance, or am I focused on actually helping them comprehend it? Now, the other factor to that is the industrial engine. Now, the truth of the matter is, when the industrial engine turned on, and it turned on in the US and then it spread to around the world, is the idea was, how do we get more through the assembly line? How do we crank out more and more and more and more? Now, the challenge that you run into with that, of how that impacts and affects you when it comes down to the area of accounting, is that when you were going through your training, you were trained to work in the industrial engine. Now that you kind of stepped out to, whether it's you're starting your own firm or you're taking your skill set to the next level in accounting and finance in your corporate career, is you got to be willing to think outside the box. Because sometimes being able to help your clients and being able to help your counterparts actually comprehend what you're saying, it means you probably have to take a different approach to this. You can't do it the same way that you've always done it. You gotta change your angle a little bit. And that directly, I guess you say, conflicts with the way we were taught to be part of the industrial engine. So you definitely want to keep these things in mind as you start realizing, like, I was trained to focus on compliance. Now I need to balance in comprehension. Is my audience comprehending what I'm saying? And then also, everything about my training really pushed me to be a person who focuses on being part of the greater process. When I'm like, you know what? I need to be able to make that switch. The next area is really when it comes down to practical. Practical is, it is simply being able to go from the theoretical to the real world. Now, if you think about it, in our training, now there are some uniqueness to this, but for the most part, in our training as accountants, we were trained on the theory. We were not all trained on the real world application of business, or the real world application of what we know in the business world. Now, yes, there are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, we weren't really trained how to think in the real world through these things. We were taught the compliance route. We were taught the theory, because one of the challenges that a lot of business owners, and even just if you're in a corporate career, when I talk to, whether it's the director or the VP of sales, engineering, operations, whatever, one of the biggest challenges and feedback that they have for their accounting department is, That person knows the theory, but I don't think they actually understand how this works in our business. I don't think that they understand how this works in the real world. And that is an unfortunate, thing that I hear repeated commonly. So one of the things that you have to do to be a great accountant is you have to be able to move from the theoretical into the real world. Now, also, another thing that you really have to start thinking about is when you're trying to figure out and understand, am I, focused on, or am I practical? Because great accountants are practical. Some of the questions that you need to ask yourself is, whenever I am looking at information and whenever I am analyzing something, or whenever I'm doing my job, the question you have to ask yourself is, who cares? Now, this is not to demean the value of what you do. It's to really get you to a very clear perspective on who is the audience. Like, really, you want to understand the work that I'm doing. Who does this matter to? Like, who is going to be impacted the most by what I am doing, what I'm analyzing, what I'm talking through, what I'm working on? You really want to make sure that you think through that. Like, who really cares about what I'm doing? The next one is you want to ask yourself, so what? Like, the so what factor, it really it gets down to, okay, all right. Yes, I know who my audience is. All right. Now you have to ask yourself, okay, all right, if I'm thinking about that audience and I'm analyzing this, let's say, for example, revenue recognition, I'm looking at revenue recognition. My audience is going to be the sales team. Now, the question is, okay, what is it that what is it that they need to know? Like, now that I know my real world scenario that I'm working through, I know who my audience is. Now, okay, what do they need to know? Like, what are the important factors? I mean, what is it that they need to take out of this subject matter, and how do I communicate that to them? And that is the part that great accountants know how to focus on that. They know how to narrow in on that, and they know how to get clarity on that. And then the last part is, it really comes down to now what? The now what factor is really, the real world situation. You know who your audience is. You know what they need to know. Now that you have communicated, at the very end, you ask yourself, okay, now that they know this, what is the action that needs to be taken after this? Like, once I give this information, this insight, this revelation, whatever you want to call it, once I give this to my audience, what are they going to do? Like, is it actionable? Will this be enough for them to be able to say, now that I know this, or now that I have this from my accountant, I know what to do next? Because that's where a lot of accountants tend to struggle, and where it becomes a very big difference between a person who's a good accountant and a person who's a great accountant. Because a great accountant, or let's say a good accountant, they know their compliance, they know their subject matter, they know how to think through these different things and do different technical things. But a great accountant, what they know how to do is they know how to start helping other people understand what actions need to be taken based on what I just shared. They know the now what. Now, the third area is the communication area. Now, you'll see a lot of similarities between some of this starts to cross over with comprehension. Now, in the communication area, where this becomes extremely important, or I would say is extremely important, is understanding that there is a difference between reading and spoken communication, or written and spoken communication, or reading and speaking. And this becomes a huge challenge for a lot of accountants, is when they don't understand that there is a very, very big difference between what you're reading and what you are speaking. And the reason why this becomes a difference is because, believe it or not, we all perceive them differently. For example, if you heard me speaking and I mispronounced a word, Or, I mean, like, you see it all whenever you've traveled around the world or you're speaking to people from different parts of the world, they'll say a word and they pronounce it a little bit different. Like, I have some friends in Australia, some of the words that they pronounce that I don't pronounce it that way. After you've heard it, you kind of like, okay, cool, I get it. I understand what they're saying. And there are some words that I say that I pronounce differently. And it's just like, okay, after a while, you hear it and you kind of move forward. But now let's take on the other hand. Let's say if you were reading something and something was actually misspelled. Immediately, when you start to see misspellings in a written communication, it starts to immediately lower your perception of the value of what is trying to be communicated. Like, again, whenever you hear someone pronounce something differently, if you were to translate it into actual, like, actual written words, how they pronounce it and how it's spelled, it would almost look like a misspelling. But when it comes down to spoken language, we are okay with accepting, people pronouncing things different way. But when it comes down to written, if someone were to misspell something, it would completely throw you off. And so that's where one of those areas where I say there is a very big difference between, what people are reading from the written communication, and then when you're speaking and when you're actually communicating with spoken word. Like, you have to understand that there's a difference, because what tends to happen is people try to either speak like they write. And most of you've probably sat through a CPE course, or you've probably gone through a conference, and what you have seen is you've sat there and you listen to someone who pretty much just said exactly what was written on the screen, and it just didn't sit well with you. It didn't connect as well with you. I mean, you were there, you stayed there to get the CPE credit, but you didn't really stay because it was actually connecting. But if you actually went and you heard someone actually speaking, where they weren't just reading what they wrote, but they actually started to say, okay, all right, how will people understand this when I say it out loud? And they start, and you could see, like, hey, what they physically wrote on the page or on the slide, what they actually said, it was slightly different because they made it contextual. And that is the key point, is just making things contextual. It's just really understanding who your audience is, and then adjusting to, how am I going to get this information across to the audience in the best way possible? Because if I can get this information across to the audience in the way that they can receive it best, that is a sign of a great accountant. The last one is really focusing on the medium of communication. Now, when it comes down to how you communicate, the method, or I guess you say the medium that you use, it's going to impact the way you approach communication. For example, if I were in a, say if I were doing a college lecture, the medium of my communication would be a lecture style. How I communicate in that space might be very different from, let's say, if I was using TikTok as a method of communicating financial information. How I communicate in those two, because I'm using two different types of mediums, how I communicate in one may be contextually relevant for the classroom, but it might not be contextually relevant for, let's say, a social media app that I'm using. Or let's say if I'm communicating through, video conferencing, whether I'm doing a Zoom or StreamYard or whatever, versus if I'm sending you an email. How I'm approaching that can be very different. Like I said, the medium that I'm using to communicate and get the information across to you, it plays a very, very big role in how I adjust. And the thing about it is, a great accountant knows this. A great accountant understands this. A great accountant does not look at the medium and say, oh, well, that's not worth my time, or that's not worth my energy. A great accountant, if you know your audience and you know your message, then what you start to do is you start to ask yourself, what is the best medium for me to use to communicate to my audience? And if I am able to best communicate my information to my audience through that medium, then I also have to understand how do I contextually show up on that platform? How do I contextually show up at that method? Again, clear example. I wouldn't be if I were, if I was talking to a client on the phone versus if I were giving a presentation, how I approach that conversation would be very different. And that's something that great accountants know and they understand. Because one of the things that I've seen with average or okay accountants is they are exactly the same. How they give a lecture is how they talk on the phone. How they talk on the phone or how they give a lecture is the same way that they talk in person, or they show up the same way on social media, and people just don't resonate with it. Now, part of understanding that is really, like I said, as you start to understand your audience more and you realize that people show up with almost kind of like a different perspective of their personality in different atmospheres. Like if I saw you at a business lunch versus if I saw you at home with your kids, you might be you'll be the same person, but you'll be a different perspective of your personality. Because, and you see it a lot of times, like how a person is in the office may be very different when you see them, let's say on the weekend when they're with their kids, or you see them at home in their environment. I mean, because what we begin to understand is that the context and the medium which we are communicating with people, it does bring out a different perspective of that person. And that's something we should definitely be aware of. Now, the fourth area that I really want to bring people's attention to is that great accountants are multilingual. Now, when I say multilingual, I'm not referring to, oh, they speak, they speak English, Spanish, Portuguese, they speak Mandarin, and they speak Russian, they speak German, French, all these different languages. What I'm more so referring to is that they can speak different, I guess you would say, languages of business. Because whether we realize it or not, is that the different departments in a company, they kind of speak, almost like a different language. Like if you've ever sat down and you talked to the legal department in any company, what you'll realize is they may be speaking English, but the words that they are using could have a completely different context and a completely different meaning in their world as opposed to your world. Or let's say if you've ever sat down and you've spoken with someone in engineering, like again, they may be speaking English, but the things that they are saying may have a different context than what you understand it. And one of the areas that becomes very, very, very obvious is when it comes down to acronyms. Because there may be acronyms in finance and accounting that mean something to you one way, but then when you're talking to someone who's in marketing, like it may mean something completely different. Or let's say you're talking to someone on the sales team, that same word could have a completely different meaning. And in that context, that's where I say that, hey, you have to learn how to speak the language of the area of business that you're trying to speak to. So if you're talking to a person in marketing, you have to talk to them in a language that they understand. And not necessarily saying that you have to say things exactly the way that they say them, but you may have to actually approach the conversation maybe with a little bit more patience and a little bit more time, because you may have to actually explain some of the acronyms that you throw out, or you may have to explain some of the concepts that you throw out. And one of the obvious areas that I've seen this happen a ton, and it happens continually, and it needs to stop, is in the area of revenue recognition. Accountants are very, very good at understanding the revenue recognition criteria. But when you're talking to a sales professional and you're trying to explain all of the concepts, the ins and the outs about revenue recognition, it might not actually land very well with them, because they may not have a good basis for what you are trying to explain. They may not have a good basis, and they may not understand what you are trying to communicate. So you want to make sure that you can get out of your box and you can understand the world from their perspective. Because when you are able to understand the world from their perspective, what it does is it allows you to be able to speak their language. And when you can speak their language, you will get more cooperation, you will get better collaboration, and you will be seen as a great accountant. Now, this becomes very, very important for, whether you are in a corporate career or whether you're running your own firm. You want to make sure that you understand your audience. Now, if you haven't been paying attention, that's something that I have said many, many times. In a lot of these elements, anytime we've talked about any of the four elements, one of the very obvious things that I have said is you got to know your audience. That becomes a foundational. If you are going to be successful at any of these four elements, or you're going to be successful at all of these four elements, you need to know your audience. You need to understand what is it that they need? What is it that they do? Who are they? What do they care about? What is important to them? Because when you understand that, what it then does is it helps you start to move effectively through all four of these areas so that you can be a great accountant. Now, when it comes down to comprehension, the question is, okay, all right, practically speaking, Terrell, how do I get better at all four of these areas? Like, what can I actually do? So, here are a couple of tips that I think you should definitely keep in mind. When it comes down to comprehension, what you can do to get better at comprehension is actually ask the people that you are speaking with, whenever you explain something to them, at the end of it, to ask them this simple question. Hey, I want to make sure that what I just communicated, that I'm getting the right message across. What did you understand from what I said? What you will be surprised is that you probably weren't as clear as you thought you were. But when you are able to ask that question, it will help you start to tweak and make adjustments so that you can understand. Am I focused on compliance, or am I actually focused on helping them understand? In the practical, question is, how do I get better at being more practical? I think asking yourself that simple question. Once a person receives this information, receives this report, what action are they going to go take? And if what I am providing them does not lead them to an action, then I'm probably not being as practical. Because what practical should lead to is it should lead to action. And then in the area of communication, you ask yourself, how can I get better at communicating? One of my out of the box, scenarios or tips for you is to go and watch stand-up comedians. One of the things that I learned in studying stand-up comedians is when you're watching a stand-up comedian, one of the very obvious things that you're going to notice is they have a very clear structure the good ones have a very clear structure. They know the punchline that they're trying to communicate. They also understand that I need to set this punchline up. I can't just give you the punchline. I need to set it up. I need to keep you engaged. I need to take you on the journey, and I need to arrive at the punchline in a timely and crafty way. Now, when it comes down to you becoming a better communicator as an accountant, what I would say is study other communicators who are really, really good. And I would say comedians are probably some of the best communicators in our environment, because most of the time they have less than a few minutes to set up a situation, understand their audience, set up a situation, have a punchline, and get their audience to the punchline so that their audience stays engaged. So definitely study other great communicators. Now, how do you become multilingual? The way that you become multilingual is by understanding other people's worlds. I mean, I think the same way you will learn a new language, it's like you want to immerse yourself. So one of the things that I recommend, you know, is to go attend the department meetings of your counterparts. Like, if you want to understand how to actually speak the language of a salesperson, go sit in a sales meeting, and don't sit in there to ask questions. Sit in there just to learn to understand. And that's if you're in the corporate world. Now, if you're in your own firm, buy some marketing books and listen how they talk about different concepts. If you want to learn about engineering, go buy a book on engineering and listen to the way that they talk about their concepts. Listen to the words that they use. Listen to the phrases that they use commonly. Because when you begin to have more conversations and you begin to listen to what they say and you listen to how they say it, what it does is it allows you to step into a whole new world of understanding. So what you really want to do is take those principles, take those concepts, and really start to leverage them to really take things to the next level. Now, one of the things that I always say for all business owners and all accountants is you want to get very clear on your messaging. Like I said, you want to make sure probably the most central point that you can make sure is that you understand who your audience is. Because if you can clearly understand your audience, I will tell you the rest of this stuff becomes very easy. So now you have it. So thank you so much for tuning in. And as always, continue to come back for more exciting, great concepts on how to become a better accountant, how to run a better firm, and how to make a bigger impact.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Finance and Accounting Show. If you like what you heard, don't be selfish. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and then share this with a friend, because you know a business owner that could definitely use this insight. So be sure to hit that subscribe button, share it with a friend, and turn on the notification bell so you get all the updates when we release a new episode.